Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born in 1900, and for the greatest part of the century, she made her mark in a special way with millions of people throughout the English-speaking world. In Northern Ireland, she was regarded with a particular affection because she represented the Scottish connection of the royal family. And given the strong links between Northern Ireland and Scotland, people here regarded the Queen Mother very much as one of their own. She always received a warm welcome on her many visits. She was a lively lady with a bonny smile and a friendly nature. The former Ulster Unionist Party leader, Lord Molyneux, met the Queen Mother on numerous occasions as a Privy Councillor. He admired the lady tremendously and felt the same empathy with her as his electorate.
Yes, I think that was the case, and that she therefore related, as Scotsmen Scotsmen and Scotswomen tend to relate to people in Northern Ireland and vice versa. And I think there was too the feeling that there were both nations, you know, Northern Ireland on the one hand, Scotland on the other, were to some extent a little distance from the centre of power at Whitehall, and maybe that gave them sort of fellow feeling as well.
Yes, the Queen Mother is reported to have made remarks about the centralisation of power when she was in Africa. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, this was in the period after many of the colonies had achieved independence, and she was on an official visit to one of those former colonies. The new president was giving off about how good it was to be free of English domination, because the English were a very arrogant, domineering race and very difficult to live with and all the rest of it, and they treated us, the natives, with contempt, he said. Queen Mother patted him on the arm and said, "I know, my dear, we have the same problem with them in Scotland."
During the Troubles, she visited the province regularly, often coming unannounced for security reasons. On one occasion, at a garden party at Hillsborough, a group of ladies arriving at the gates were told the Queen Mother was to be the royal visitor. They whooped in delight at the news that they were to see the lady they regarded as their favourite royal. The baby girl who was to become the Queen Mother was born on August the 4th, 1900, the 9th of 10 children of the Earl of Strathmore, whose seat was at the historic Glam's Castle, so ancient it was even mentioned in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Terry Woolsey, in her biography Elizabeth of Glamis, records that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had a gloriously happy childhood, mostly spent with her younger brother David, but that as a teenager the horrors of the First World War touched her, as she lost one brother and another was seriously wounded. Although not old enough to nurse, she helped the war wounded who were rehabilitated in her family's castle by running errands for them. This photographic portrait of the future Queen, taken when she was a teenager, reveals the beauty which was to drive Bertie Windsor, the future King George VI, wild with love, to the extent that he proposed to her several times over, the first time when she was only 20, before being accepted after 2 years of courtship. Even her father-in-law-to-be, King George V, despaired of her ever accepting his second son. It would have been about the time that King George and Queen Mary were visiting Belfast in 1922 that Bertie Windsor was pursuing Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon with an increasing ardour. Queen Elizabeth was to say later that she got on famously with her father-in-law, and that she didn't fear him in the same way his children did, and it was a great loss to her when he died. Oddly, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was described in the newspapers of the time as a commoner marrying into the royal family when she wed the Duke of York, she with a family tree going back to Robert the Bruce. As princess, the future queen brought a breath of fresh air to the gloomy formality of Buckingham Palace in the 1920s, though it's interesting to note, given the excesses of later royal wives, that she was severely rebuked by the palace staff for giving an interview to a newspaper on the announcement of her engagement. Not done, she was told. Like more recent royal wives, she became a fashion trendsetter. Wherever she went, she created fashion trends in her youth, and her followers spent their life copying her style. High fashion among the more mature matrons of the English-speaking world for weddings and christenings bore an uncanny resemblance to the Queen Mother's outfits, and of course, she was a milliner's delight throughout her life. The abdication of her brother-in-law, Edward VIII, in 1936, resulted in her becoming queen, and in 1937 Belfast saw her for the first time with her beloved Bertie, who chose to be known by the title King George VI rather than Albert. They were rapturously received by thousands of Belfast citizens on their post-coronation tour of the city, during which they laid a wreath at the cenotaph and attended a civic reception at the City Hall. But as the citizens of Belfast celebrated their royal visitors, the clouds of war were already brewing in Germany and were to burst 2 years later. It was at this time that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was to rise even further in popularity, refusing to leave London during the Blitz and putting herself in personal danger to visit the survivors of the nightly bombing raids.
I was in the Air Force at that time and occasionally encountered the royal family visiting the East End of London, which was so badly bombed. And I remember that remark she made when Buckingham Palace itself was bombed. She dusted down her desk and looked around and said, "Well now, at long last I can look the people of the East End in the face."
The King and Queen were next seen in Northern Ireland at the war's end in 1945, when they came to say a personal thank you to the servicemen and women who had helped defeat Germany. They arrived at Aldergrove in a converted Dakota troop-carrying plane with the two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, and set out on a Meet the People tour, which was unprecedented. 100,000 people went to Stormont to see them. They held a garden party at the then governor's house at Hillsborough, and they boarded a boat on the Foyle at Londonderry to see the mass of German U-boats tied up at Lissahalli, surrendered to the Allied forces after the fall of Germany. The royal tribute to Derry and its brave soldiers, sailors and airmen, including the thousands of Americans based there, passed off without dissent, according to press reports of the time. Sadly, her husband, King George, was to succumb 6 years later to ill health, which had dogged him for most of his life, and at the age of 51, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became a widow and saw her daughter Elizabeth crowned Queen. It must have been a great help to the new Queen to have someone like the Queen Mother. What do you know of that situation?
It was an enormous help because, of course, people make the great mistake of thinking that the monarchy is a mere figurehead. The sovereign is actually far more powerful than any prime minister. Prime ministers are only a temporary phase anyway, and that's no disrespect to them. That happens